Factory manager Derek Coleman thought humiliating a quiet woman in front of an entire factory would make him look powerful. But less than an hour later, the same woman would solve a machine failure that had already defeated 10 professional engineers, and the sound that followed would not be laughter, but silence. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and support our team so we can keep bringing you powerful stories about dignity, justice, and unexpected brilliance. The massive steel walls of Hanover industrial manufacturing echoed with the relentless noise of machinery as forklifts rolled across the polished concrete floors under harsh fluorescent lights. Hydraulic presses thundered like distant storms, while conveyor belts carried thousands of automotive components through the production line every hour. Inside Plant C, tension was already spreading faster than the heat rising from the overworked machines. At exactly 7:12 that Monday morning, one of the factory's primary hydraulic forming systems had shut down without warning, freezing nearly half the facility's production. Red warning lights flashed across the control panels, while engineers in blue hard hats crowded around the dead machine with growing frustration. Every minute of downtime was costing the company nearly $18,000. Derek Coleman stormed across the factory floor with the confidence of a man who believed authority alone could solve problems. At 48 years old, the factory manager wore his tailored gray suit like armor against everyone beneath him. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the concrete as workers stepped aside to avoid his glare. "Why is this line still dead?" he barked at the engineering team. "We've been on it for 3 hours," one engineer answered nervously while wiping sweat from his forehead. "The system keeps failing during pressure synchronization." Derek cursed under his breath and looked around at the growing crowd of nervous employees gathering near the stalled machine. Then his eyes landed on Claire Bennett, standing quietly beside a tool cabinet with a clipboard in her hands. Claire looked almost invisible compared to the chaos around her. Her faded Navy maintenance uniform hung loosely against her thin frame, and her blonde hair was tied back in a plain low ponytail. At 39, she moved with calm efficiency, speaking rarely and never drawing attention to herself. Most employees barely noticed her beyond polite nods in the hallway, but Derek noticed her now because she had been staring at the disabled machine for far too long. "You planning to fix it for us?" Derek mocked loudly enough for nearby workers to hear. A few engineers chuckled immediately. Claire lowered her eyes slightly. "I was just listening to the vibration pattern before it shut off," she said softly. Derek laughed harder this time. "Listening to the vibration pattern?" he repeated with open ridicule. "Unless you suddenly became a mechanical engineer overnight, stay out of the way and let the professionals handle it." Several workers smirked while others looked away uncomfortably. Claire simply nodded once and stepped back toward the edge of the production line. But even as the engineers returned to arguing around the machine, her eyes remained fixed on the silent hydraulic press. The flickering red warning lights reflected faintly across her face, while the heavy smell of hot oil filled the air around her. And somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the arrogance, and beneath the humiliation spreading across that factory floor, Claire Bennett heard something none of the others could hear at all. The engineers continued circling the disabled hydraulic press like frustrated surgeons around a patient they could not save. Diagnostic tablets glowed beneath the cold factory lights, while warning alarms pulsed every 30 seconds with mechanical indifference. Sweat darkened collars. Tempers shortened. And still the machine refused to restart. Claire Bennett quietly resumed her normal duties as though Derek Coleman's public humiliation had not happened at all. She pushed a maintenance cart down the narrow service corridor beside the production line, replacing worn safety labels and checking fluid levels in smaller auxiliary systems. Most workers never paid attention to her because Claire had spent years mastering the art of becoming invisible. Invisible people heard everything. "Corporate is already asking questions," one supervisor whispered near the break area. "If this line stays dead another 2 hours, we lose the Milwaukee contract." Claire said nothing as she passed them, but her eyes shifted briefly toward the silent forming machine across the factory floor. Something about the shutdown bothered her, not the failure itself. Machines failed all the time. It was the rhythm before the shutdown, the uneven pulse hidden beneath the normal vibration pattern. She had heard it less than 10 minutes before the line stopped completely. Deep inside the massive steel frame, something had fallen out of synchronization. The problem was that none of the engineers were listening to the machine anymore. They were only listening to their computers. In the far corner of Plant C, Ethan Brooks leaned against a workstation while studying another set of pressure readings. At 28 years old, Ethan was one of the younger engineers at Hanover Industrial, smart enough to understand the system, but inexperienced enough to admit when he was lost. He watched Claire from across the floor as she tightened a loose valve connection on a nearby coolant unit. "You really think she noticed something?" he quietly asked Walter Hayes. The older engineer scoffed immediately. "She is maintenance staff, Ethan. This equipment costs $12 million. You do not troubleshoot systems like this by intuition." Ethan glanced back toward Claire anyway. Earlier, when she mentioned the vibration pattern, she had not sounded confused. She had sounded certain. Derek Coleman suddenly slammed a clipboard onto a metal table hard enough to make several workers jump. "Enough guessing," he snapped. "We are bringing in outside consultants." A heavy silence spread across the engineering group. Everyone understood what that meant. Failure. Expensive failure. Walter rubbed his forehead in frustration. "Earliest specialist team from Chicago cannot arrive until tomorrow morning." Derek cursed under his breath again. "Then we run overtime all week to recover production." The atmosphere inside the factory grew heavier by the minute. Conveyor belts sat motionless under bright fluorescent lights, while unfinished metal components remained frozen halfway through assembly. Forklift operators stood around drinking stale coffee. Supervisors checked their watches every few minutes. The entire plant felt suspended in tension. Claire slowly walked past the dead hydraulic press carrying a toolbox in one hand. As she crossed behind the engineering group, her eyes lifted briefly toward the machine's central drive housing. Then she stopped walking. Just for a second. Her expression changed almost invisibly. Ethan noticed it immediately. Claire stepped closer to the machine and tilted her head slightly, listening beneath the hiss of nearby air compressors. One faint metallic sound echoed from deep inside the system. A tiny irregular click repeating every few seconds. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the toolbox handle. "That is not pressure failure," she said quietly. Several engineers looked up in annoyance. Derek turned toward her with disbelief already written across his face. "Excuse me?" Claire hesitated for half a heartbeat before speaking again. "It sounds like the alignment sensor is compensating for a mechanical offset." Walter let out a dry laugh. "That is impossible. The sensor array was replaced 6 months ago." Claire remained calm. "I did not say the sensor was broken." Derek folded his arms slowly. The factory lights reflected sharply across his cold expression as workers nearby began watching again. "Then please," he said with obvious mockery, "educate the engineering department." And somewhere behind Derek's arrogance, behind the sarcastic smiles, and behind the growing crowd gathering around the dead machine, the first crack in his certainty had already begun to form. The crowd around the dead hydraulic press grew larger with every passing minute. Workers who should have been operating forklifts or monitoring assembly stations now stood pretending to organize tools while secretly watching the confrontation unfold. Even the constant hum of the factory seemed quieter near Plant C, as though the entire building sensed something unusual was happening. Derek Coleman stared at Claire Bennett with open irritation while crossing his arms tighter against his chest. "Go ahead," he said with exaggerated patience. "Tell us how the real problem magically escaped 10 licensed engineers." A few nervous laughs followed, though weaker than before. Claire remained calm beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "The synchronization fault is reacting to another issue," she explained quietly. The machine is compensating for resistance somewhere inside the drive alignment. Walter Hayes shook his head immediately. That does not even make sense. We checked the alignment systems twice. Claire looked toward the silent machine again instead of arguing. Did you check the lower secondary housing? Walter scoffed. There is nothing in the lower housing except support rotation assemblies. Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. Exactly. Derek let out a sharp breath through his nose, already losing patience. This is ridiculous. He gestured toward the engineering team. You all hear this. Our maintenance clerk suddenly thinks she understands industrial hydraulics better than people with actual degrees. Several workers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ethan Brooks stayed silent, but his attention never left Claire's face. What unsettled him was not confidence. It was precision. Claire was not throwing out random guesses like desperate people usually did around malfunctioning equipment. Every word sounded deliberate, measured, like someone describing a problem she already understood. Derek stepped closer to her now, lowering his voice just enough to sound more personal and more humiliating. Do you know what happens when unqualified employees interfere with $12 million worth of machinery? Claire met his eyes calmly. Sometimes they notice things everyone else misses. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. For half a second, nobody spoke. Then Walter gave a dismissive laugh. You think this is intuition? He said. Industrial systems are not repaired by instinct. Claire glanced briefly toward the machine again. No, she answered softly. They are repaired by listening. A faint metallic clicking echoed once more from deep inside the hydraulic frame. Tiny, irregular, almost impossible to hear beneath the surrounding noise. But Claire heard it immediately. So did Ethan this time. His expression changed. Wait, Ethan interrupted carefully. I heard that. Walter frowned. Heard what? Ethan walked closer to the machine, kneeling beside the lower panel. Another faint click echoed from inside the housing. Derek looked annoyed now rather than amused. It is thermal expansion, Walter insisted quickly. Normal under pressure. Claire slowly shook her head. No, the timing is uneven. The room grew quieter again. Ethan looked back toward Claire with growing uncertainty. What causes uneven timing? Claire hesitated briefly, as though she already knew nobody wanted the answer. A micro-shift in rotational alignment. Walter immediately rejected it. Impossible. If the alignment shaft moved even half an inch, sensors would detect it instantly. Claire finally looked directly at him. Unless the compensation software kept correcting the readings fast enough to hide it. Silence, real silence this time. Walter's expression stiffened. Ethan slowly stood upright. Derek looked between them with visible frustration as confidence began slipping from the room. That would require a cascading feedback correction, Ethan admitted quietly. Walter frowned harder. Theoretically. Claire nodded once. And if the correction loop runs long enough, hydraulic pressure eventually falls out of synchronization. Ethan turned toward the machine again, his eyes widening slightly as realization began connecting pieces inside his mind. Derek noticed the shift immediately and snapped. Do not tell me you are actually entertaining this. Ethan hesitated. I am saying, she might not be wrong. Those 5 words changed the atmosphere inside plant, see more than the machine failure itself. Because for the first time that morning, someone from the engineering department had stopped laughing. The shift in atmosphere spread through plant C almost immediately. Workers who had been quietly amused only minutes earlier now watched Claire Bennett with cautious uncertainty. The factory floor still smelled of overheated hydraulic fluid and machine oil, but the laughter had disappeared. Derek Coleman noticed it too, and the realization irritated him more than the broken machine itself. Authority depended on certainty. The moment people started doubting him, the room changed. Derek straightened his suit jacket and forced a sharp laugh. So now we are taking technical advice from maintenance staff, he said loudly, making sure nearby workers heard every word. What is next? The janitor redesigns the production line? A few uncomfortable chuckles followed, though weaker this time. Claire remained completely still beside the disabled hydraulic press. The red emergency lights reflected across the steel housing behind her, while warning alarms continued pulsing through the factory every 30 seconds. She did not defend herself. She did not react emotionally. And somehow, that calmness made Derek even more frustrated. Ethan Brooks stepped toward the lower access panel again. "Actually, I want to check something," he said carefully. Walter Hayes frowned immediately. "You are seriously wasting time on this?" Ethan ignored the comment and crouched beside the machine. He placed his hand lightly against the steel frame, listening as another faint clicking sound echoed from deep inside the housing. Click, pause, click, click. Uneven. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Claire quietly spoke without moving closer. "The compensation cycle is lagging every fourth rotation." Walter folded his arms with visible annoyance. "You cannot possibly know that from sound alone." Claire looked toward the machine. "You can if you have heard it before." Derek let out a cold laugh. "And where exactly would you hear something like this before? Watching online repair videos?" Several workers looked down awkwardly. Ethan slowly removed the lower inspection panel while Walter muttered under his breath. Warm air hissed outward from inside the machine. The enormous drive assembly sat partially exposed beneath layers of steel reinforcement and hydraulic tubing. Ethan scanned the rotating coupler carefully while the system attempted another failed reset cycle. Then suddenly his expression changed. "Wait," he whispered. Walter stepped closer. "What?" Ethan pointed toward a narrow section near the secondary alignment shaft. "There." The steel rotation marker shifted almost invisibly during the cycle delay. Barely noticeable, less than a quarter inch, but enough. Walter's face tightened immediately. Derek moved closer now, irritation fading into concern. "What are you looking at?" Ethan swallowed slowly. "The alignment drift is real." Silence spread outward like a shockwave. Several engineers crowded closer while Ethan checked the readings again. Claire had been right. The machine was compensating for a hidden mechanical offset that standard diagnostics had failed to isolate. Walter stared at the rotating assembly with disbelief written across his face. "That should not even be possible," he muttered quietly. Claire finally stepped closer to the machine for the first time since the confrontation began. The software kept correcting the pressure imbalance, she explained calmly. But every correction increased stress on the secondary shaft until synchronization failed completely. Ethan looked back at her slowly. "How did you know?" Claire hesitated briefly. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly against her pale expression while forklifts sat motionless in the background. "Because the vibration pattern changed before the pressure did," she answered. Derek's jaw tightened. He hated the direction this conversation was going. More workers were gathering now, whispering quietly among themselves while watching Claire instead of him. He could already feel control slipping away from the room. "Fine," Derek snapped suddenly. "Congratulations, you guessed correctly." Claire looked at him evenly. "I did not guess." The words landed with quiet force. Ethan stared at Claire differently now, not with curiosity anymore, with respect. And somewhere deep beneath the factory floor, beneath the tension, and beneath Derek Coleman's collapsing confidence, the dead machine waited silently for the one person in the building who actually understood it. The atmosphere inside Hanover Industrial no longer felt like a normal workday. It felt like the final minutes before something important broke apart completely. Workers stood frozen beside idle conveyor belts, while engineers whispered around diagnostic screens that suddenly seemed less trustworthy than before. The giant hydraulic press remained silent in the center of Plant C, like a wounded animal, surrounded by people too proud to admit they did not know how to save it. Derek Coleman paced beside the machine with growing agitation. Every few seconds he checked his watch, then looked toward the upper offices overlooking the factory floor. Corporate executives were already asking for updates. Clients were waiting. Production schedules were collapsing by the minute. And somehow, the quiet woman he mocked less than an hour ago had become the center of attention. Derek hated it. "All right, Walter Hayes muttered while reviewing the latest system data. Even if the alignment drift exists, correcting it requires a full recalibration shutdown. Ethan Brooks frowned. That could take 12 hours. Minimum, Walter replied grimly. A wave of frustration spread through the nearby supervisors. 12 hours would destroy the week's production targets. Derek rubbed his temples aggressively before snapping. Then we wait for the Chicago consultants. Claire Bennett stood quietly near the open lower housing panel, her eyes still fixed on the slow rotation cycle. You do not need consultants, she said softly. Derek turned immediately. Here we go again. Claire ignored the sarcasm completely. The shaft itself is not damaged. Walter shook his head. You cannot know that without dismantling the entire lower assembly. Claire finally crouched near the machine, listening as another uneven compensation cycle echoed through the steel housing. Click, pause, click, click. Her expression sharpened slightly. No, she said quietly. The shaft is pulling against resistance from the secondary stabilizer. Ethan looked toward her immediately. That would explain the delayed correction loop. Walter frowned deeper now, struggling between skepticism and reluctant curiosity. Claire continued calmly. The stabilizer bracket probably shifted during the pressure spike last week. Ethan's eyes widened. The overload incident. Walter slowly looked toward the lower housing again. Nobody had connected the overload event to the shutdown because the system appeared stable afterward. But if Claire was right, the damage had been subtle enough to hide itself inside the software compensation cycles. Derek crossed his arms again. Even if this fantasy theory is correct, nobody is touching that machine until outside specialists arrive. Claire stood slowly. Then the line will stay dead until tomorrow. The sentence landed heavily in the silent factory. Workers exchanged nervous looks. Supervisors whispered quietly near the production monitors. Every passing minute was bleeding money from the plant. Ethan looked toward Derek carefully. She might be able to isolate the stabilizer manually. Derek stared at him in disbelief. You cannot seriously be suggesting this. Ethan hesitated, but only briefly. She has been right about everything so far. The room fell silent again. Derek looked around and realized something dangerous. People were listening to her now. Worse, they were starting to trust her. His authority was no longer absolute inside Plant C. Claire removed her worn maintenance gloves slowly and placed them on top of her toolbox. The motion was calm, deliberate, almost ritualistic. If the stabilizer is realigned before the compensation cycle overloads again, the pressure system should synchronize normally, she explained. Walter stared at her. How do you know all this? For the first time all morning, something distant moved behind Claire's eyes. Not pride, memory. My father rebuilt hydraulic systems for 30 years, she answered quietly. He taught me how to hear problems before sensors could see them. Derek scoffed loudly, but the sound felt weaker now, because nobody else laughed. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead while the massive factory remained suspended in uneasy silence. And standing beside a machine worth millions of dollars, the quiet woman everyone overlooked no longer looked invisible at all. The factory floor had become so quiet that even the smallest sounds carried through Plant C with unnatural clarity. The distant hum of ventilation fans echoed above the silent production lines, while warning lights continued flashing against steel walls stained with years of heat and machine oil. Nobody was working anymore. Every eye remained fixed on Claire Bennett and the disabled hydraulic press standing before her like a challenge nobody else had been able to overcome. Derek Coleman rubbed his jaw impatiently before pointing toward the machine. This conversation is over, he said firmly. Nobody touches that system without authorization from corporate engineering. Claire picked up a wrench from her toolbox without reacting to his tone. Then the secondary stabilizer will keep grinding against the alignment shaft until the entire synchronization assembly fails. Walter Hayes looked sharply toward the machine again. Ethan Brooks swallowed uneasily. Both engineers knew what that meant. if the stabilizer locked completely under pressure. Repairs would take weeks instead of hours. Derek noticed the fear crossing their faces and immediately became defensive. We are not risking catastrophic damage because someone with no engineering credentials thinks she hears vibrations. Claire finally looked directly at him. You already are. The sentence hit the room like cold air. Derek opened his mouth to respond, but another harsh, grinding click echoed from inside the hydraulic housing before he could speak. Louder this time, more unstable. Several workers visibly flinched at the sound. Ethan stepped closer to the open access panel and checked the pressure monitor again. His face tightened instantly. Pressure variance just increased another 7%. Walter muttered under his breath. That should not be happening this fast. Claire crouched beside the machine calmly, studying the rotation timing with focused eyes. The compensation loop is accelerating. Derek looked furious now, but beneath the anger something else had started creeping into his expression. Uncertainty. For the first time all morning, he no longer sounded like the man in complete control of the room. How long before full failure? Ethan asked quietly. Claire listened to the machine for several seconds before answering. Maybe 20 minutes. The entire factory seemed to freeze. Supervisors exchanged alarmed glances while workers whispered nervously near the conveyor stations. Derek turned toward Walter immediately. Is she exaggerating? Walter hesitated. That hesitation alone said everything. The older engineer looked toward the machine with growing concern before answering carefully. If the stabilizer completely seizes under load, she could be right. Silence swallowed the room again. Derek slowly looked back toward Claire, who had already removed the lower service cover completely. You really think you can fix this? He asked coldly. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the housing and lightly touched part of the rotating assembly before pulling her hand back. Her movements were steady, familiar, like someone working with an old language they had spoken their entire life. I know what is wrong, she said quietly. Ethan stared at her hands. They did not shake, not even slightly. Derek folded his arms tighter. And if you are wrong, Claire stood slowly beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Then you lose a machine. Her eyes shifted briefly across the silent factory floor around them. But if nobody does anything, you lose the entire line. The words settled heavily over everyone listening. Somewhere in the distance, a forklift alarm echoed once before fading into silence again. Derek looked around the room and realized something he never expected to feel inside his own factory. He was out of options. Ethan finally broke the silence. At this point, he said carefully, what exactly do we have left to lose? Nobody answered him, because deep down, everyone standing there already knew the truth. The machine worth millions of dollars was no longer waiting for a team of engineers. It was waiting for the quiet woman they almost laughed out of the room. For a long moment, nobody inside Plant C moved at all. The giant hydraulic press sat silent beneath the harsh factory lights, while dozens of workers watched Claire Bennett standing beside the exposed lower housing with nothing but a worn toolbox and a calm expression. The tension in the room felt almost physical now, heavy enough to press against every steel beam and concrete wall around them. Derek Coleman finally stepped aside with obvious reluctance. 5 minutes, he said sharply. That is all you get. Claire nodded once without celebrating, without smiling. She simply knelt beside the machine as though the noise, the pressure, and the crowd surrounding her no longer existed. Ethan Brooks immediately crouched nearby, unable to hide his curiosity anymore. Walter Hayes stayed back with folded arms, still skeptical but no longer dismissive. Claire leaned closer to the open assembly housing and listened carefully while the unstable synchronization cycle clicked through another uneven rotation. Click, pause, click, click. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she reached toward the secondary stabilizer bracket buried deep beneath the hydraulic tubing. Flashlight, she said quietly. Ethan handed one to her immediately. Claire angled the beam into the narrow housing gap while oil-stained steel reflected dimly beneath the light. There, she whispered. Ethan followed the flashlight beam and froze. A thin support bracket near the secondary stabilizer had shifted just enough to create microscopic rotational drag against the alignment shaft. Small enough to fool the sensors, large enough to slowly destroy synchronization under pressure. "How did nobody catch that?" Ethan murmured. Claire calmly reached for a socket wrench from her toolbox, because the system kept correcting the symptom instead of revealing the cause. Derek stood several feet away watching with visible frustration. Every second Claire remained composed made him look smaller in front of his employees. The workers surrounding the machine had gone completely silent now. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. They simply watched the quiet woman everyone overlooked move through the machine with calm certainty. Claire loosened 2 mounting bolts carefully before adjusting the stabilizer bracket by less than half an inch. Her movements were precise, efficient, familiar, like someone repeating a lesson practiced 1,000 times before. Walter frowned while watching her hands. That adjustment should not work without recalibrating the entire assembly. Claire did not look up. Normally, yes. She tightened the final bolt before wiping her hands slowly against a shop towel. But the compensation loop has already been recalibrating itself for hours. Ethan stared at her with disbelief. "So you are using the software corrections against the malfunction?" Claire finally nodded once. "The machine already told us how to fix it." A hush fell across Plant C. Claire stood slowly before walking toward the main control panel beside the hydraulic press. Red warning lights still flashed across the dark display screen while pressure alerts echoed softly through the silent factory. Derek crossed his arms tighter. "If this fails, shut the system down immediately," he warned. Claire rested one hand lightly against the restart controls. For a brief second, her expression softened almost imperceptibly, as though she remembered another workshop long ago. Another voice teaching her to trust sound more than numbers. Then she pressed the restart sequence. The factory held its breath. Hydraulic pressure hissed sharply through the system as warning alarms pulsed once. Twice, the massive drive assembly rotated slowly inside the steel housing. Ethan watched the pressure monitor nervously while Walter stared at the alignment readings in disbelief. 3 seconds passed, then 5. The clicking sound disappeared completely. A deep mechanical hum rolled through the hydraulic press as synchronization locked into place for the first time all morning. Conveyor systems flickered back to life across Plant C. Green status lights illuminated one after another down the production line. And in the stunned silence that followed, the machine that defeated 10 engineers roared back to life beneath the hands of the quiet woman they almost ignored. The sound of the hydraulic press returning to full synchronization rolled through Hanover Industrial like thunder after a storm. Conveyor belts lurched forward one by one, while green operational lights illuminated across the production floor in a chain reaction of restored power. Forklift operators stared motionless from across the warehouse. Supervisors froze beside their tablets. Even the distant workers at the far assembly stations stopped what they were doing to look toward Plant C. For several long seconds, nobody spoke at all. The machine that had shut down nearly half the factory was running perfectly again. Ethan Brooks kept staring at the pressure monitor as though expecting the system to fail a second time. But the readings held steady. Stable. Balanced, normal. His eyes slowly lifted toward Claire Bennett with open disbelief. "Pressure synchronization is locked," he whispered. Walter Hayes stepped toward the monitor himself, scanning the data with growing confusion. "That is impossible," he muttered under his breath. The recalibration cycle should have taken hours. Claire quietly wiped her hands with the same oil-stained towel while the restored machine hummed smoothly behind her. "The recalibration already happened," she explained calmly. "The system spent hours correcting the offset automatically. It only needed the stabilizer returned to center." Walter looked at her as though seeing her clearly for the first time all day. Derek Coleman, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. Just minutes earlier, he stood at the center of the room with absolute confidence, mocking the quiet maintenance worker in front of his employees. Now the same employees were staring at Claire instead of him, some with amazement, others with embarrassment, a few with admiration. Derek's jaw tightened as he struggled to regain control of the moment. "Well," he finally said stiffly, forcing authority back into his voice, "I suppose we got lucky." Ethan immediately turned toward him. "Lucky?" he repeated in disbelief. Derek straightened his suit jacket defensively. "She made an adjustment. That does not make her an engineer." Claire never reacted to the insult. She simply closed her toolbox slowly while the machine continued operating perfectly behind her. But the room had already changed too much for Derek's words to matter anymore. One of the supervisors stepped closer to the engineering monitor and shook his head. She identified the exact fault before diagnostics did. Another worker quietly added and fixed it in less than 10 minutes. Derek heard every word. So did everyone else. The authority in his posture began cracking under the weight of public realization. Walter Hayes looked toward Claire again, his expression no longer arrogant. "How did you know the compensation loop would stabilize after the adjustment?" Claire paused briefly before answering. "Because the machine was not failing randomly," she said softly. "It was trying to protect itself." Ethan stared at her with growing respect. "You understood the system better than all of us." Claire shook her head slightly. "No, I just listened to it longer." Silence settled over Plant C once again, but this silence felt different from before. It was no longer filled with mockery or tension. It was the heavy silence people fall into when pride collapses in front of undeniable truth. Derek looked around the room and realized nobody was looking at him anymore. Not really. The workers who laughed with him earlier now avoided eye contact entirely. Walter remained focused on the perfectly stable readings. Ethan could not stop watching Claire. The fluorescent lights reflected softly against the steel machinery, while the restored production line roared steadily around them. And standing quietly beside the machine she had just saved, Claire Bennett looked exactly the same as she had that morning. Same faded uniform, same calm posture, same quiet voice. The only thing that changed was that now everyone finally understood who had been standing in front of them the entire time. The shift in atmosphere spread through Plant C almost immediately. Workers who had been quietly amused only minutes earlier now watched Claire Bennett with cautious uncertainty. The factory floor still smelled of overheated hydraulic fluid and machine oil, but the laughter had disappeared. Derek Coleman noticed it too, and the realization irritated him more than the broken machine itself. Authority depended on certainty. The moment people started doubting him, the room changed. Derek straightened his suit jacket and forced a sharp laugh. "So now we are taking technical advice from maintenance staff," he said loudly, making sure nearby workers heard every word. "What is next? The janitor redesigns the production line?" A few uncomfortable chuckles followed, though weaker this time. Claire remained completely still beside the disabled hydraulic press. The red emergency lights reflected across the steel housing behind her, while warning alarms continued pulsing through the factory every 30 seconds. She did not defend herself. She did not react emotionally. And somehow, that calmness made Derek even more frustrated. Ethan Brooks stepped toward the lower access panel again. "Actually, I want to check something," he said carefully. Walter Hayes frowned immediately. "You are seriously wasting time on this." Ethan ignored the comment and crouched beside the machine. He placed his hand lightly against the steel frame, listening as another faint clicking sound echoed from deep inside the housing. Click. Pause. Click, click. Uneven. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Claire quietly spoke without moving closer. "The compensation cycle is lagging every fourth rotation." Walter folded his arms with visible annoyance. "You cannot possibly know that from sound alone." Claire looked toward the machine. "You can if you have heard it before." Derek let out a cold laugh. "And where exactly would you hear something like this before? Watching online repair videos?" Several workers looked down awkwardly. Ethan slowly removed the lower inspection panel while Walter muttered under his breath. Warm air hissed outward from inside the machine. The enormous drive assembly sat partially exposed beneath layers of steel reinforcement and hydraulic tubing. Ethan scanned the rotating coupler carefully while the system attempted another failed reset cycle. Then suddenly his expression changed. "Wait," he whispered. Walter stepped closer. "What?" Ethan pointed toward a narrow section near the secondary alignment shaft. There. The steel rotation marker shifted almost invisibly during the cycle delay, barely noticeable, less than a quarter inch, but enough. Walter's face tightened immediately. Derek moved closer now, irritation fading into concern. "What are you looking at?" Ethan swallowed slowly. "The alignment drift is real." Silence spread outward like a shockwave. Several engineers crowded closer while Ethan checked the readings again. Claire had been right. The machine was compensating for a hidden mechanical offset that standard diagnostics had failed to isolate. Walter stared at the rotating assembly with disbelief written across his face. "That should not even be possible," he muttered quietly. Claire finally stepped closer to the machine for the first time since the confrontation began. The software kept correcting the pressure imbalance, she explained calmly. But every correction increased stress on the secondary shaft until synchronization failed completely. Ethan looked back at her slowly. "How did you know?" Claire hesitated briefly. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly against her pale expression, while forklifts sat motionless in the background. "Because the vibration pattern changed before the pressure did," she answered. Derek's jaw tightened. He hated the direction this conversation was going. More workers were gathering now, whispering quietly among themselves while watching Claire instead of him. He could already feel control slipping away from the room. "Fine," Derek snapped suddenly. "Congratulations, you guessed correctly." Claire looked at him evenly. "I did not guess." The words landed with quiet force. Ethan stared at Claire differently now, not with curiosity anymore, with respect. And somewhere deep beneath the factory floor, beneath the tension, and beneath Derek Coleman's collapsing confidence, the dead machine waited silently for the one person in the building who actually understood it.